19-year-old Leanne Walters was selling raffle tickets at a family barbecue on the morning of September 2nd, 1984. It was Father's Day in Australia, and the Viking Tavern car park in Milperra, southwestern Sydney, had been advertised as a motorcycle swap meet. More than 400 people had turned up with their children to browse parts and enjoy the day. She had no idea she would not make it home. Neither did 6 other people in that car park. What nobody in that crowd knew was that 2 rival motorcycle clubs had chosen this public venue on this family Sunday to settle a war between them. Within minutes, the shooting started. When it stopped, 7 people were dead and 28 were wounded. The club that planned it was the Comancheros. This is their story. William George Ross was born on August 5th, 1943 in Glasgow, Scotland. He had served in the British Army before emigrating to Australia in 1964, and he brought with him the military discipline, a command structure, and a very specific idea of what obedience was supposed to look like. On April 15, 1966, Ross founded the Comancheros Motorcycle Club on the NSW Central Coast with 4 other men. He named it after a 1961 John Wayne film, but the organization he was building had very little to do with entertainment. The structure of the organization was similar to a paramilitary organization. The hierarchy ran from the top down, and every member understood their position within it. And Ross sat at the very top under a self-proclaimed title: Supreme Commander. Ross had built the organization that made him absolute authority. The command structure flowed in one direction from top to bottom only. And challenging the Supreme Commander was a breach of the foundational principle the entire organization was built on. For nearly 2 decades, the structure held. The club grew across Sydney, building a reputation that spread well beyond the motorcycle world. But in 1982, the challenge Ross had designed his organization to prevent arrived anyway, and it came from inside. The man who challenged Ross was Anthony Spencer, a senior member of the Sydney chapter, who everyone in the club called Snotty. He had been inside the Comancheros long enough to know the rules, but he broke them anyway. In 1982, Spencer formed a second Comancheros chapter in Sydney, operating out of a clubhouse at 150 Louisa Street in Birchgrove. He was still using the Comancheros name, but he was no longer answering to Ross. For a supreme commander who had built his entire organization around the principle of absolute authority, that was not something that could be overlooked. Spencer did not stop there. In November 1983, his chapter patched over to the Bandidos, who had begun expanding into Australia. In doing so, Spencer had committed 2 offenses at once. He had left the Comancheros, and he had joined their enemy. Every man who followed him had done the same, and in the world Ross operated in that made all of them targets. In retaliation, Ross declared war on Spencer directly. Colin Campbell, a Bandidos sergeant-at-arms, described the situation as the bitterness of men who felt betrayed by people they had once called brothers. 2 men who had once been on the same side were now building towards something that only one of them would walk away from. And the place where it finally happened was a car park in Milperra on Father's Day 1984. The Milperra massacre. The Comancheros arrived at the Viking Tavern car park before the Bandidos. 19 of them spread quietly across the venue while families browsed the swap meet stalls around them. When 34 Bandidos arrived shortly after, they had no idea the ambush had already been set. Both clubs opened fire on each other. The shooting lasted roughly 10 minutes. 7 people died. 4 Comancheros and 2 Bandidos, and 14-year-old Leanne Walters, who had been selling raffle tickets at the family barbecue and had no connection to either club. Ross himself was shot in the head during the confrontation and survived with a permanent brain injury. Colin Campbell, the Bandidos sergeant-at-arms who had said the whole war was about betrayal rather than money, was shot 6 times and spent 6 weeks in intensive care before checking himself out. But the things with Anthony Spencer took a strange turn. Spencer was arrested at the scene and charged with constructive murder as the Bandidos' national president, held liable for the actions of his members. He was taken to Long Bay Prison and later transferred to Parklea Prison while awaiting trial. On the afternoon of April 28, 1985, He was late to the prison clinic to collect his prescribed sedatives after a meeting ran long with fellow Bandidos members. The pills were denied. That night, Spencer was found dead in his cell. He had himself. He was 29 years old. The man whose defection had started everything never faced a jury. What followed was the longest joint criminal trial in New South Wales history. 43 individuals were charged with 7 counts of murder, each under the doctrine of joint criminal enterprise. Justice Adrian Roden named Ross as primarily responsible. He received a life sentence, but served approximately 5 years before the charge was reduced to manslaughter on appeal and was released in 1992. The massacre forced significant changes to gun laws across New South Wales. But if Australian authorities believed Milperra had broken the Comancheros, they had misread the organization entirely. The club did not collapse because its supreme commander went to prison. It adapted. And what came next was worse. Leadership changes 2002 to 2009. Years passed, and by the early 2000s, a younger and more aggressive faction inside the Comancheros had decided Ross was no longer the right man to lead the club. They chose Mahmoud Hawi as their leader. Mahmoud Hawi was born in Beirut in 1980. In 1985, his family fled the Lebanese Civil War as refugees and settled in Sydney. He grew up in the city, attended Punchbowl Boys High School, and left at 16 to work in his father's spray painting business. By 1999, he had joined the Comancheros. By 2002, a younger and more aggressive faction inside the club had decided Ross was no longer the right man to lead it, and chose Hawi as their leader. He took control at 22 years old, just 4 years after joining the club. Ross had built the Comancheros on military discipline and a rigid command structure. Hawi had no interest in keeping the club's wars behind closed doors. Under his leadership, the Comancheros took their conflicts into public spaces. And on March 22, 2009, that approach produced consequences that made front pages across the country. Hawi and a group of Comanchero members boarded a flight from Melbourne to Sydney. On the same flight was Derek Wainohu, the president of the Australian Hells Angels. By the time the plane landed, both men had already texted their members to meet them at Terminal 3 of Sydney Airport. At Gate 5 on a Sunday afternoon, the brawl erupted in front of more than 50 passengers. Members of both clubs ripped 17-kilogram steel check-in bollards from the floor and used them as weapons. Security guards had nothing to defend themselves with, and police arrived after it was already over. Among those who came when the texts went out was Anthony Zervas. He was 29 years old and not a Hells Angels member. He was the younger brother of a senior member who had asked for help. He was beaten to death with a bollard and stabbed multiple times before police reached the scene. Hawi was arrested, convicted of murder, and sentenced to 21 years. The conviction was later reduced to manslaughter on appeal, and in 2015, the parole board released him. Just 3 years later, on February 14, 2018, Hawi was shot dead outside a gym in Rockdale in Sydney's south. The Aussie cartel. When Hawi was in prison, the club needed new leadership. Duax Ngakuru, known as Dax, took over as national president in late 2009. But in 2011, Ngakuru fled Australia to Turkey, alongside his close associate, Hakan Ayik, known as the Facebook gangster, after believing Australian law enforcement was closing in on their alleged drug empire. With the national president gone, Mark Buttle, a 38-year-old from Maroubra, stepped into the role. Under Buttle, the club stopped being just a motorcycle organization involved in crime and became something that law enforcement agencies would describe as a criminal enterprise, operating at a national scale. Intelligence agencies alleged that Buttle was the central figure in what they called the Aussie cartel, a group of 9 Australians from outlaw motorcycle gangs and Middle Eastern organized crime who were allegedly responsible for 1/3 of all drug imports into Australia. The cartel was not just importing drugs. It was allegedly taxing everyone else who was. Any drug shipment coming through Sydney was subject to a fee of up to 50,000 Australian dollars per kilogram, regardless of who was bringing it in. Prices in Sydney jumped $50 a gram during this period, rising to $300 a gram. Police believe the tax was the reason. Under Buttle, the club stopped being just a motorcycle organization involved in crime and became something that law enforcement agencies would later describe as a criminal enterprise, operating at a national scale. But while Buttle was building that empire in Australia, the government was making a decision that would export the organization's reach to a country that had no infrastructure to deal with it. The deportation pipeline. In 2015, Australia introduced Section 501 of the Migration Act. The provision allowed the government to deport any non-citizen with a criminal conviction serious enough to fail a character test. Since 2015, more than 3,000 people have been removed from Australia on those grounds, stripped of their visas and placed on flights to countries some of them had not lived in since childhood. Among those thousands were patched members of Australia's most established outlaw motorcycle clubs. Men from the Mongols, the Notorious, and the Comancheros, who had spent years building criminal networks across Australia, arrived in New Zealand with their reputations intact, and nothing waiting for them on the other side of that flight except the country listed on their birth certificate. For Australia, the policy worked. The problem was gone. But the problem did not disappear. It landed somewhere else. New Zealand received the largest share of those deportees, and experienced officers in the New Zealand police recognized almost immediately that what they were dealing with was not low-level offenders struggling to reintegrate. These were organized and dangerous individuals being dropped into a criminal landscape that had no existing infrastructure to absorb or contain them. What Australia had done was solve its own problem by creating New Zealand's. And while Australia was deporting foreign-born Comanchero members to New Zealand, its own national president was quietly making the same journey in the opposite direction. In 2016, Buttle left Australia voluntarily. A security guard named Gary Alabon had been shot dead during an armed robbery on Sussex Street in Sydney in 2010, and Buttle was named as a person of interest in that killing. He left on February 1, 2016, and moved first to Dubai, then to Northern Cyprus, which has no extradition treaty with Australia. From there, he continued running the Comancheros remotely. The government had exported its problem to New Zealand. Its national president had exported himself to the Mediterranean. But both of them left behind the same thing: an organization that did not need its leadership present to keep operating. And in New Zealand, one man had already understood that better than anyone. The New Zealand chapter. The man who understood the opportunity most clearly was Pasilika Naufahu. He had been a sergeant at arms for the Comancheros in Australia before he was deported to New Zealand in 2016. A sergeant at arms in an outlaw motorcycle club is the enforcer, the man who maintains discipline and protects the hierarchy. Naufahu was not a foot soldier arriving in an unfamiliar country with nothing to work with. He was an experienced operator who knew exactly how the organization functioned and what it needed to establish itself somewhere new. New Zealand's criminal landscape at the time was dominated by the mongrel mob and black power. What those organizations did not have was international reach or cartel connections. Naufahu saw the gap and moved into it. He built the New Zealand Comancheros chapter from scratch, and by the time police began to understand the full scope of what had been established, the club had an estimated 50 to 60 members across chapters in Christchurch and other areas. They had linked up with the Sinaloa cartel to establish a supply chain moving methamphetamine and cocaine from Mexico into New Zealand. Parcels of methamphetamine were hidden inside kitchen appliances, shipped from the United States, and distributed through a network of frontmen while the club's hierarchy collected the profits. This was not street-level dealing. It was a supply chain built to scale. In 2019, police responded with Operation Nova. Raids across the country netted more than $3.7 million in assets, including luxury vehicles. Naufahu was arrested. In February 2021, he was sentenced to 10 years in prison for participating in an organized criminal group conspiring to supply controlled drugs, money laundering, unlawful possession of ammunition, and assault. The parole board twice refused his early release, still considering him too dangerous to release into the community. But the organization he had built did not stop because he went to prison. it kept running without him. And what investigators found when they kept looking was worse than what had already been seized. The drug import. Naufahu was not the only senior Comanchero who arrived in New Zealand with an operation already in mind. In 2016, the same year Naufahu landed, police intercepted 501 kilograms of methamphetamine on 90 Mile Beach on the Northland coast, one of the largest drug seizures in New Zealand history at that point. A senior Comanchero member named Ulakai Fakaosilea was identified as having orchestrated the shipment. He was convicted and sent to prison. He did not stop there. While serving that sentence, Fakaosilea ran a second operation from inside his cell. This time, 199 kilograms of methamphetamine hidden inside thresher machines shipped from Dubai. He sourced the product, coordinated the logistics, and arranged the delivery while the New Zealand prison system believed it had already removed him from the equation. When the second operation was uncovered, he was convicted again and sentenced to life imprisonment. Fakaosilea was running an international smuggling operation from a prison cell. Naufahu was building a distribution network from the ground up while on parole. Buddle was coordinating shipments from a laptop in northern Cyprus. The organization did not need its people to be free to keep moving. It needed them to have a phone and a network they could trust. The religious divide. While the Comancheros were building their operation in New Zealand, the organization back in Australia was fracturing from within. And for law enforcement watching from outside, a fracturing organization is not just a problem for the people inside it. It is an opportunity. When Ross founded the Comancheros in 1966, the club drew its membership from a specific world: white Anglo-Celtic working-class men from the same Sydney suburbs who understood the same unspoken codes. Under Howie, that changed. The club began recruiting heavily from Sydney's Lebanese and Pacific Islander communities, and the organization that emerged looked very different from the one Ross had built. The shift brought with it divisions that had existed long before anyone put on a Comanchero patch. Sydney's Lebanese Muslim community had been split along religious lines for decades. Sunni Muslims concentrated in the city's west and southwest. Shiite Muslims in the St. George area to the south. Two communities that carried generations of tension between them from the Middle East. And now, under the same club banner, both were operating inside the Comancheros. The Comanchero city crew was led by a Beirut-born Shiite from the St. George area. On the other side of an increasingly hostile internal divide was a new club called Notorious, whose leadership had deep roots in Sydney's Sunni Lebanese community. Their motto left little doubt about how they intended to conduct themselves. Only the dead see the end of war. Law enforcement considered Notorious the prime suspect in the February 2009 bombing of a Hells Angels clubhouse in Petersham that closed an entire street and damaged 7 neighboring businesses. What was playing out was not simply a turf war between rival clubs. It was a sectarian conflict that had followed its participants from the Middle East to the streets of Western Sydney and found a home inside one of Australia's most dangerous criminal organizations. Divided organizations make mistakes, and divided loyalties create informants. Both of those things were about to become very useful to the people hunting the Comancheros. Operation Ironside and the app that caught them. After Australian and American law enforcement took down Phantom Secure, the encrypted communications platform that organized crime had been relying on, the criminal underworld needed a replacement. The FBI provided one. They had access to a new encrypted app called Anom and began distributing it through criminal networks without anyone inside those networks knowing that the FBI was running it. The AFP provided the technical capability to decrypt and read every message sent through the platform in real time. The app was installed on mobile phones, stripped of every other function. The phones could not make calls or send emails. They could only send messages to another Anom device. To get a device, you needed to know someone already in the network. High-profile organized crime figures vouched for the app, and it spread organically through the underworld. What those people did not know was that every message they sent was being read by law enforcement the moment it was sent. One of the men who allegedly used Anom was Mark Buttle. The AFP alleges he used the app to coordinate the shipment of more than 160 kilograms of cocaine from Hong Kong to Melbourne via Sydney in May 2021. Street value, 40 million Australian dollars. On June 7, 2021, more than 4,000 Australian law enforcement officers executed hundreds of warrants simultaneously across every mainland Australian state under Operation Ironside. 224 offenders were charged on 526 charges. 3.7 tons of drugs, 104 weapons, $44 million in cash seized. In Victoria alone, more than 20 Comanchero members, including several from the club's hierarchy, were arrested. The investigation had been running covertly for 3 years. The criminals using Anom had no idea until the warrants hit their doors. In mid-July 2022, a Melbourne court issued an arrest warrant for Buttle. An Interpol red notice followed. Turkey, where Buttle had moved after leaving northern Cyprus, made an independent decision to deport him. He was escorted by Turkish authorities on a charter flight to Darwin, where AFP officers were waiting. On August 3, 2022, he was arrested at Darwin Airport. He faces 2 charges each, carrying a maximum sentence of life in prison. His case remains before the courts as of early 2026. After Buttle's arrest, Duax Ngakuru resumed his role as Supreme Commander directing operations from Turkey. In January 2023, Ngakuru was arrested in Turkey on charges of drug smuggling. His cousin Shane Ngakuru had already been arrested in Thailand in October 2022 on charges of being a super facilitator between the Comancheros and Asian crime syndicates in Southeast Asia. One by one, the people running the organization from the outside were being removed from the board. But while the leadership structure was collapsing at the top, the chapters on the ground were still operating. And in New Zealand, the Christchurch chapter had been running its own supply network between the North and South Island for years, without anyone yet understanding its full scale. Operation Avon and Task Force Morpheus. Operation Avon was the investigation that finally broke the Christchurch chapter of the New Zealand Comancheros open. The National Organized Crime Group spent 8 months watching the chapter before moving. What they documented was a drug distribution network running between Auckland and Christchurch on a regular schedule. 4 kilograms of methamphetamine every fortnight, $1.4 million at street value per delivery. Over the course of the investigation, police alleged more than $15 million worth of drugs had moved between the North and South Island through the chapter's operation. One of the men at the center of that network was Kelvin James Waikaira, the chapter secretary. He had attended an international gang conference in Spain that cost $28,000 and was trusted enough within the organization that the court later described him as well connected to the upper echelons of the group. When police searched his address on the day of the operation, they found more than $8,000 in cash and a collection of prepaid cards. He was sentenced to 6 years in prison. On August 29, 2024, police executed approximately 70 warrants across Christchurch and Auckland in a single morning. Every patched member of the Christchurch chapter was arrested. 18 men aged between 18 and 55 appeared in court on charges of participating in an organized criminal group and conspiracy to supply methamphetamine and cocaine. Police seized 5 kilograms of Class A drugs and restrained a further $1.9 million in assets, including 11 vehicles. Across all 4 phases of the investigation, 137 charges were laid against Comanchero members and associates. The network was gone by the end of that morning, but the operation that demonstrated most completely how seriously 2 governments were taking the Comancheros came on March 5, 2026. Task Force Morpheus brought together every Australian state and territory police force alongside New Zealand Police, the Australian Federal Police, the Australian Criminal Intelligence Commission, and the Australian Taxation Office. All of them on the same day, executing warrants against the same organization across 2 countries. By the end of that single day, 56 people were facing a combined 168 charges, with 51 search warrants executed, 4 visa cancellation referrals made, and 37 firearms protection order compliance checks conducted. The 60-year arc. William George Ross founded the Comancheros in 1966 on a principle he believed was unbreakable: absolute loyalty, absolute authority. A command structure that flowed in one direction and could not be challenged from below. 60 years later, the organization is still standing, but every leader it produced ended up in a prison cell, a grave, or a foreign country with an extradition warrant. Ross went to prison for Milperra. Howie was shot dead outside a gym. Ngakuru fled to Turkey and was arrested there. Buttle ran the organization from northern Cyprus until Turkey deported him and the AFP was waiting at Darwin Airport. But the club kept running. Jock Ross built the Comancheros to be immune to outside pressure. What he could not build was an organization immune to itself. From a massacre at a family swap meet in 1984 to coordinated raids across 2 countries in 2026, the Comancheros spent 60 years proving that no arrest could stop them. But every leader they produced ended up in a prison cell, a foreign country, or a grave. Click the next video to see what those moments look like when the sentence is finally delivered.